Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get things started here pretty soon. I know we have a couple of people walking back in from lunch, but thanks to everyone joining us in person and braving what may be some stormy winter weather here in a little bit. So thanks for sticking around, and thanks for those joining online as well. So we're going to kick this off. Our third debate panel for the day is on a topic that has come up quite a bit in some of our earlier conversations with Representative Whitman and as well as our previous two panels. So this proposition is specifically on China is increasingly working with Russia, North Korea, and Iran as part of an axis, and that axis is in quotes, to push back against the US-led West. And so, for this panel, we have two phenomenal speakers joining us today, and I'll just briefly introduce them. They have long, illustrious careers, so I'll just try to capture some of their background. Speaking for the proposition, we have Dr. Andrea Kendall-Taylor, who is a senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at Center for New American Security. She's also a distinguished practitioner in grand strategy at Yale University's Jackson School and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. From 2015 to 2018, she was the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia on the National Intelligence Council in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And then before that, she was a senior analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency, where she worked on Russia and Eurasia. So deep expertise here on all things Russia, and so I think she'll bring a lot of that particular expertise to this conversation. Next, we have Dr. Zhao, who's speaking against the proposition. He is the director of the International Politics Program at the National Institute for Global Strategy at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He's also a research fellow at CAS's Institute of World Economics and Politics. He's worked at various think tanks in China and the United States, including at Tsinghua University. And his research focuses on, most importantly, on U.S. strategic relations, geopolitics in East Asia, and also the Belt and Road Initiative. I would just note that I was just talking to Zhao that we are both alumnus of the Hopkins Nanjing Center in Nanjing, which is a long history of training U.S. and Chinese scholars. So I just like to plug that. Yeah. Well, with that, I'll just we'll turn it over to voting here in just a second. So truly, maybe if you could walk us through how that works. But if you haven't been here to our previous debates, we'll do a pre-debate poll and see how those results go, and then we'll do another poll at the end of this and see how convincing some of these arguments may be.
So to vote, you can just type in the URL on the left-hand corner or scan the QR code with your phone on the right-hand corner. If anyone has any questions or needs help, feel free to just raise your hand and I can come over.
Okay. Yeah, well, it looks like we are just about an even split, which I think means this will be for quite an interesting debate. Yeah, and I think this actually maybe isn't too surprising given some of the policy discussions I think that are going on in Washington. And I think even Representative Whitman's comments this morning were suggestive of, yes, this is this axis or whatever we want to call it is a growing source of focus here in Washington from the policy community, but also there's no clear sense there's no necessary consensus here. So I think the voting that we're seeing here is really reflective of that. So yeah, with that, I'll turn it over to Andrea and I'll let you kick us off.
Great. Well, I'm really happy to be here, and I do. The voting is very interesting. At least we have a level playing field that we're starting from. Okay, well, I'm very happy to be here speaking about China's role in what I have called, along with my colleague Richard Fontaine, the axis of upheaval. I know you heard axis of evil this morning. I would put a slightly different spin on it to call it the axis of upheaval, which is really the term that we coined to describe the growing relationship between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And I know that a lot of people really bristle at the term axis, but in my view, it really is the most appropriate way to describe the dynamics that we see playing out among these countries today. And if you go back and look at the way that even Benito Mussolini used the term, so the very first time that he introduces the term axis was back at a speech that he gave in Milan in 1936. And he described Italy's relationship with Germany, and I'll use his quote, as an axis around which all European states, animated by a desire for peace, may collaborate on troubles. And I think that very well describes what we see from China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. It's exactly what they are doing. They are simply collaborating on their troubles. And it really is that shared aim of weakening the United States and its power and its influence that provides such strong motivation for the actions that we see today. So if we think about what the axis of upheaval is, I would describe it really as just a collection of dissatisfied states that have converged on a shared purpose of overturning US leadership, along with the principles, the rules, and the institutions that now underlie the prevailing international system. So the argument that I want to make in the time that I have is that the cooperation among this axis of upheaval is growing, and that the relationship between these countries is likely to be far deeper and durable and more consequential than many analysts and policymakers currently assume. I would actually say it's one of the most significant national security challenges facing the United States and its allies. And so to unpack that argument, I really just want to make 4 overall points. So point number 1 is to talk about and make the argument that their relationship in the defense domain is growing, and that that's increasing the military capabilities of America's adversaries. The second point is to look at the economic and diplomatic realms. There too, we can make an argument, I will make an argument that that cooperation is growing, and that then has the impact of diluting the foreign policy tools that the US and its allies has to confront or address their destabilizing actions. Point number 3 is that as Xi personalizes power, a lot of political science research would suggest that that personalization of power is often related to a greater acceptance of risk. And if that is indeed what we're seeing, then the axis of upheaval, China's relationships with China, Iran, and North Korea will become an ever valuable situation for China. And then the final point is I would argue that they're developing a shared vision of the future that does indeed raise the prospects that their relationship will be durable. So I just want to walk through those, but before I do that, I will say that I recognize that there are long-standing, deep disagreements, there are differences, and there are fissures among all of these countries. That is definitely true. And I also recognize that their cooperation is often happening largely bilaterally in dyads. That's also, for the time being, true. It hasn't really, except in a couple of cases that we can talk about, morphed into the kind of multilateral realm. So I recognize all of these caveats and limitations, and yet what we see is that their cooperation continues to grow. Despite all of these differences and disagreements, cooperation is growing in significant ways that will have important implications for the US and its allies. So on point number 1, military ties, their cooperation, amplifying military capabilities of all of America's adversaries. Ukraine is point 1, 2, 3, and 4 for me. China, along with Iran and North Korea, really has been a critical enabler of Russia's war machine in Ukraine, and it has been a key factor that has allowed Moscow to sustain and prosecute the war in a way that wouldn't have been possible without the backing of those countries. China, in particular, has been Russia's most critical lifeline, the way it's bought up large amounts of oil and gas that's put billions of dollars back into Moscow's coffers, and it has sent vast amounts of technology that Russia has been able to use, things to enable it, machine tools for tanks, propellants for missiles, intermediary goods for gunpowder and explosives, turbojet engines, even geospatial intelligence that provides information on targeting that Russia uses to hit targets inside Ukraine. And it really is that access of technology, the computer chips and chip components, that has allowed Russia to sustain its defense industrial base and again continue to prosecute its war. China has a lot to gain from this. It's gaining access to critical technology that boosts its military capabilities relative to the United States, and it's gained political support for its revisionist aims in the Indo-Pacific. Already before the war, Russia was a major supporter of the Russian military. From 2018 to 2022. Russia supplied 83% of China's arms imports, very meaningful support that helped China develop its air defense, its anti-ship, and its submarine capabilities. They've been expanding the size and scope of their joint military exercises, including with Iran. In this case, it's one important example of at least a trilateral instance of their cooperation. That's important for China because the military is untested. Russia, now having fought in Syria, but in particular Ukraine, is able to share its battlefield knowledge with China, helping it overcome what has been a key vulnerability relative to the US military. And although China has narrowed the technological gap, Russia is a less important military supplier. It is likely that they will move more into joint production, co-development, and there are also areas where Russia remains ahead on satellites, aircraft engine, and other important things. And so if Russia is able to pressure if China is able to pressure an increasingly dependent Russia, then again, it can help boost China's military capabilities relative to the United States. And there's one important announcement I really like to highlight to amplify, or to at least to illustrate, the accelerating nature of their military cooperation. In September 2024, a senior US official made an announcement that Russia is now sharing submarine technology with China. And I highlight that because we at CNAS had done a report back in 2021 that tried to imagine how Russia-China collaboration could develop. And in the military domain, this sharing of submarine technology was at the very outer bounds of what we could possibly imagine Russia would be willing to do for China, given the highly sensitive nature of these technologies. And in just 4 short years, we're already here. And so to me, that really illustrates the extraordinary pace at which this relationship is deepening. Okay, point number 2, it's also happening in the economic sphere, and it's diluting the foreign policy tools that the US and its allies have to confront them. They are learning from and they are aiding each other in how to effectively circumvent US sanctions. I just talked about how China is helping Russia circumvent its sanctions, but it's also happening in other areas. China provides Iran with US sanctions-resistant trade and easier access to advanced technology. And as a result, the Iranian regime no longer fears its own economic collapse. In 2024, Beijing also abstained from the vote to renew monitoring sanctions on North Korea. So they are sharing best practices and working together in ways that dilute the efficacy of Western sanctions. They're also reducing their dependency on the US dollar. The share of Russia's imports that were invoiced in yuan jumped from 3% in 2021 to 20% in 2022. And so it's putting their own economic transactions out of the reach of US economic tools of coercion. It's making it harder for the US and its allies to use these other tools to address their destabilizing actions. And it's not just the economic sphere, thinking in the diplomatic sphere. It's getting harder for the United States to rally coalitions of countries to push back. China's refusal to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine therefore made it far easier for countries in the Middle East and Africa to sit on the fence, to not impose sanctions on Russia. They've also impeded US efforts to isolate Iran. So Russia and China together have brought Iran into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and now also into the BRICS. And you see this cooperation also playing out in the information domain. It's weakening support for US positions. China parroting Russian talking points that NATO was to blame for the invasion. In the aftermath of the Hamas attack on Israel, it was Iran, Russia, and albeit to a slightly lesser extent China, but they were all sharing messages, repeating messages, denigrating Israel, the United States, and even if they're not coordinating those messages, the very fact that they're pushing the same message, that repetition from multiple actors, makes those messages appear more credible and persuasive. Okay, point number 3 that I want to make is about the growing assertiveness of Xi as he personalizes power. And as I said, there is a great body of political science research that talks about personalist regimes are the most likely to produce the riskier foreign policies, they're the most likely to initiate wars, and they're the most likely to fight wars with democracy. And so I think as Xi is willing to take on greater acceptance of risk, then Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea actually become quite useful. And I would argue that Russia has actually become the pointy end of Beijing's sphere, that it's willing to upend dynamics in key regions in ways that actually advance what China is trying to accomplish. And I think a lot of people will say, but oh, China doesn't want instability. Some of this is too much. They don't like Russia's penchant for instability. But if you look at a couple of cases, the Houthis, for example, China didn't much push back on Russia providing arms and other things to the Houthis in the Red Sea. And I guess the final point I would make on this piece is you just don't have to look any further than the arrival of North Korean troops to understand that with highly personalized authoritarian regimes at the helm, things can move very quickly and in unpredictable ways. And I think that's a worrisome kind of reminder of just how quickly relations between these countries could grow. Okay. Finally, the final point I want to make is the other thing you'll hear is, oh, well, as soon as the war in Ukraine ends, this will all be over, or, you know, there are so many differences, this is not going to last. Well, I disagree, and I think if you're paying attention over the last 2 to 3 years, you can actually start to see the broad contours of a shared vision for the future, particularly between Russia and China, Iran and North Korea to a lesser extent. And these countries agree on things like the centrality of state-determined political rights. They all share a desire for spheres of influence. Russia and China seek multipolarity. They have this shared notion of indivisible security, or that one country can't take an action that makes another country feel unsafe. That was the justification that Putin used for the invasion of Ukraine. It's now in the Global Security Initiative. It's making its way through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I think there's a lot of overlap in the way that Russia talks about the world majority and the way that Xi talks about the community with a shared future for mankind. So I think I would say the earliest contours of a more proactive, positive vision of the world are beginning to emerge. It's not there yet, but if you asked me a year or two ago, what do they agree on, I would have been hard pressed. But the contours are starting to take shape. Final point, this is going to persist beyond the war in Ukraine. And I say that as a Russia expert who understands that yes, the war is about Ukraine, but it's about much more than Ukraine. Putin sees himself as in an existential struggle with the West. And so his desire for confrontation continues well beyond the end of the Ukraine war. And in that regard, Russia well understands that he needs China, Iran, and North Korea. He's less isolated, he's less vulnerable. And Russia really has been the critical catalyst of this axis of upheaval, and so I would expect that Russia will continue to drive the cooperation among this axis well beyond the end of the Ukraine war. And I'll end there.
Great, thank you, Andrea. A very comprehensive overview of how quickly some of these relationships are evolving at the bilateral level especially, but also some movement at the trilateral level and across different domains, political, economic, military, and otherwise. So yeah, thank you for laying that out. A very compelling case, but we'll see what Zhao has to say, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Brian, and thank you for inviting me. And also, thank you for Andrea for putting up a very convincing case, I think. But luckily, I just need to convincing 2% of the audience, and I guess only I need to convince 1 or 2 people sitting in here to change their mind and win this game. But I think one thing I want to talk first, because back in Beijing, we hear about this so-called axis of evil or upheaval thing that is going on in Washington. This morning, we hear about congressmen also talking about this issue. And you have laid out a more convincing case, arguing, point by point, how these countries are supposed to work together towards a same goal. However, I think it's quite easy from a Beijing's point of view to dismantle all of this as a U.S. bias. It's very much imaginary. Because, first of all, from China's foreign policy, there is absolutely nothing that point to a willing sort of coalition of these 4 countries to work together to dismantle the current US-led Western sort of alliance or system. For any stated China's foreign policy goals, there's nothing that China will, for example, prioritize the support of Russia, Iran, North Korea in that order, right? So that's number one. There's no stated goal for that. And number 2, I think if you look at China's letter of diplomacy and which country is important for China, it's very clear the number 1 country from our kind of list is Pakistan. And number 2 is Russia, or Pakistan and Russia probably on the same level. And then after that, you have a bunch of countries that formed strategic alliance with a partnership with China, either comprehensively or selectively, or there's a level of closeness with China. And none of those stated that somehow Iran is above other, like Middle Eastern countries, for instance, Egypt or Saudi Arabia, that is more important to China, right? And also, even North Korea, yes, North Korea has a security pact with China, but comparing to many other Chinese neighbors, China may have closer relationship with many Southeast Asia countries than North Korea, let alone, China is feeling anything, happy about North Koreans sending troops into the battlefield in Russia. So I would argue there's no clear connection among those 4 countries to form anything even close to an access, in that respect. And my third point is that if you look at China's current foreign policy priority, it's very much economic centered. And China in the world advocating for economic development, right? If you look at China's 3 global initiatives, number 1 is Global Development Initiative, number 2, Global Security Initiative, number 3, Global Civilization Initiative. And all those initiatives as a shared vision is to have development in this world. And if you look at the trade relations and development goals sharing, China has very little project or infrastructure project or cooperations with Iran or North Korea, or for that matter, Russia, even though in recent years trade is increasing with Russia. The trade with Iran is going down, actually more than 60%, over almost 70%. The trade with North Korea is also down more than half. So I don't think that in that respect, China is getting closer to those countries. Rather, they're separating further away. And China's economic relations with the Middle East, with Africa, with Latin America in particular, is increasing. So for that matter, if there's any axis, I would argue that China has an axis of development in the world, and China has a closer relationship with many developing countries in that respect. And if you look at other, from the organizational or institutional perspective, that's my 4th point, which is China's priority is BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And in those organizations, you might argue that in those organizations, you can find Russia and Iran, both, but you can't find North Korea. And in that organization, Iran is a new member from, a couple of years ago, and China and Russia is the founding member. But, in those two organizations, you can also find India. Can we add India to the axis as well, right? So it's sort of different aspect from China's perspective that which country to be a strategic partner to cooperate with. And one thing, I don't have a privileged information about how China cooperating with countries militarily. You put a lot of emphasis on how these countries might cooperate militarily. But I think China, if you look at the joint exercise and China's military cooperation with other countries, Russia may be very important, but China has very little, deep sort of economic, military relations with North Korea or with Iran. In terms of joint military exercise, sharing of military technology, and providing military materials. Even in the area of military cooperation, China, during the Ukraine-Russia war, probably provided normal dual-use technologies and materials to Russia as a normal trading practice. But the interesting thing is, if you look at the data, China may trade with Ukraine equal to its trade with Russia. Even though, China and Russia trade is mostly bilateral, right? And China buys Russia oil and gas and then sell Russia many trucks or other machinery, tools, and chips. But at the same time, in the battlefield, for instance, both sides are using Chinese drones. And China imposed drones restriction on both countries. And China sell a lot of drones to the third country, and those countries sell drones back to Ukraine. So in that battlefield, it's very hard to say which side China is actually siding with if you look at just pure sales, from a sales perspective. Again, China's official position is not supporting the war effort on either side. We have repeatedly said that we need the war to stop. It's not in China's interest because China's #1 trading partner, to remind you, that is the European Union. And if anything, China suffered a lot, the distance, the deteriorating relationship with the EU. So in that respect, actually, I would argue China would align in terms of interest with the United States more than the US realize. We could both cooperate to end that war as soon as possible. And finally, I would say that if somehow those countries work together, as you stated, against the US interest, the reality is that after the Trump came into office, the US interest itself might have changed. Right? So if, let's say, the world is moving towards a multipolar world, I would say the current Secretary of State, Rubio, is agreeing with that goal and realizing that it's already the reality. The United States is no longer a monopoly of power in the world. So in the future, I think if the US is no longer trying to pursue a monopoly of global governance and leadership, then these perceived threat of axis of upheaval may not be a reality. If you get rid of the biased glasses and look the reality of the relationship among those four countries, again, I would argue China's bilateral and multilateral relations with those countries is not in any way more prioritized than China's relations with many, many other countries in the world. And China is trying to maintain an open mind with those countries. Last thing I just want to point out, which is China's consistent principle of non-alignment has never changed. So if this proposition is saying China is increasingly working with those countries as an axis, it's not true, because if China does not change that, and China has no military alliance like the United States alliance with other partners, for instance, AUKUS, then I don't think in that military or security sense, China is organizing something concrete against the United States' interest. And finally, just I think other than this, there's probably another consensus in Washington that China is not a country. It may be can be seen as a revisionist country. China wanted to change some part of this global system that China sees as unfair and unjust. However, China is not trying to dismantle the post-World War II global system. That is a very important difference between China's goal and perhaps some of those countries you pointed out. And also regional stability, China also does not share some of those other countries' aspirations. For instance, maybe Iran, although Iran denies that, wanted to get a nuclear weapon, or North Korea wanted to maintain and possess even more nuclear weapons, which are both against China's interest. So in many ways, China does not align all of its national interests and also international sort of goals with those countries. So again, overall, I don't think this sort of setting of 4 countries, putting those 4 countries in the same category is appropriate and is definitely not a reality. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhao. Hi. Also compellingly argued. I think from what I heard, it sounds like a core part of your argument is that yes, China has significant relations with these countries, but that it doesn't amount to an axis, and that really this is U.S. kind of projecting paranoias onto Chinese actions into how it thinks about these China's activities with these countries. So yeah, I will turn it back to Andrea now for a few minutes of rebuttal,
Sure.
And then we'll turn it over to Zhao again.
Okay. Great. Yeah, definitely. They're interesting remarks, and thank you for those. I think there was one thing that you said that I found particularly interesting, which is that China has suffered a lot in Europe. And I agree with that, and I find that highly interesting because to me, this is a case where maybe for the first time, China's been willing to incur a cost in order to continue supporting its closest partner in Russia. And I will admit, at the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there were a lot of questions and really a lack of clarity about how China would respond. But over the course of now this almost 3 years, it has become crystal clear that China is standing firmly behind Russia, and it's not even close to there being any sort of parity between the way that Russia works with Ukraine and perhaps the way that Russia works with China, and the way that China has supplied some drones into Ukraine. I mean, it's really an apples and oranges kind of comparison. And throughout the war, China has been unwilling to condemn or criticize Putin. They've come up with a peace plan that I think was highly unproductive and really not serious. They have made it, again, far easier for countries in the Middle East and Africa to sit on the fence and not impose sanctions on Russia. So I think China, over the course, and then continuing to supply, I would say, increasingly lethal sorts of aid. And again, there's a lot of lack of clarity around whether or not they've crossed that line. You had the UK Ministry of Defense coming out with intelligence suggesting that China had provided some forms of lethal aid. Of course, the United States pushed back on that. But the point really is that China has gotten way up to, if not kind of crossed that line in some ways, and it almost raises a debate about what is lethal aid. So the fact that they're providing intelligence and satellite imagery that helps Russia strike targets, I mean, they have really demonstrated that they stand very firmly behind Russia in this war in Ukraine, and the fact that it has damaged relations with Europe, to me, really speaks volumes of just how important the relationship with Russia is for China. I would say then it also then is highly reflective. I guess one element we haven't talked about is the relationship between leaders and the very close personal ties between Putin and Xi. I've lost count of the number of times that they've met. It's north of 48 times now. And, Xi has called Putin his best and bosom buddy. They have a very close personal relationship, and that has really steered the trajectory of this relationship. Even irrespective of the fact that, say, for Russia, there's a lot of concerns about being an increasingly junior partner. But the line of march is clear. Putin has set the tone. Xi has set the direction. And now what you're seeing is it's becoming increasingly institutionalized, where you have all sorts of bureaucratic efforts, working groups, and other things that are now working at the institutional level. And I would, again, argue that those repeated interactions are things that form the basis of an enduring relationship. A couple of other points that you made about, China's relationships with Iran and the Middle East. It is undeniable that they have other important relations with the Saudis and others, but it is also undeniable that the relationship with Iran has continued to grow and deepen. Iran has used Chinese components to expand its military drones that it supplies to Russia. So we've seen China being very instrumental in helping Iran keep up the supply of its drones. In 2021, they signed this 25-year agreement that allows the Chinese to basically penetrate nearly all sectors of Iran's economy. Iran is selling millions of barrels of oil to China every month. So yeah, because, yes, they do have other relations in the region, but Iran is also a really important part of that. And on the North Korea side, I think that's another argument that you'll hear is that, well, Russia's doing things that Beijing won't like, especially deepening relations with North Korea. But I think the fact of the matter is that Beijing doesn't want to be left out. It doesn't want to lose leverage. And in a line that I've gotten actually from Brian, they're being pulled along in many respects by what Russia is doing and haven't been willing to take a different position. So even in these places where you see a divergence of interests or fissures in the relationship, the overarching imperative has been to kind of compartmentalize those tensions to avoid them spilling over and tainting the much larger imperative, which is having a strong relationship with each other to be united in taking on the United States and its allies. And I think I will stop there.
Zhao, back over to you.
Yeah, I think, Andrea, you've described bilateral relations again and again, but again, there's no axis among those four countries. That's my main argument. There's no axis. Historically, China was and will continue to maintain good relations with all those countries. There are historical ties. I don't want to expand on that, but that does not mean that those countries will form somehow an axis or alliance against the United States and work in coordination against the U.S. interest. So that's the first thing. And second thing, I don't want people to confuse consequence with intentions. China does not have an intention to support Russian war effort in Ukraine. The consequence of Russia continue to be able to wage war comes from perhaps the normal trading relations between Russia and China, but that's not China's foreign policy goal. So again, China is hurting from the continuation of this war, and China has proposed to end the war. And also I want to remind you, which is, if you go back to look at China's solution of this war, China's plan is actually getting closer and closer to American plan to solve this problem. That's the reality, right? Because if you can't defeat Russia, you have to make a compromise, concessions with that. And the other thing is that I think it's very important also not to confuse appearance with reality. There, you mentioned the 25-year strategic cooperation plan between China and Iran, but again, because of United States sanction, particularly because of Trump administration's extreme pressure on Iran, China has basically ceased, furthering of those plans. So far, China only invested less than, I think, $200 million in the projects in Iran, and so far, you mentioned probably there's an export of Iranian oil of around 1 million barrels per day to China, close to that. But China imports much, much more, 10 times more from the Gulf area every day, right, from other countries. So if you compare the trade relations, China has better relations, again, with Saudi Arabia, with UAE, with Qatar. And also, if you consider military cooperations, for instance, China has more military cooperation with Saudi Arabia and sells more drones to UAE than any other country in the region. So I don't think the level of cooperation between China and Iran is anywhere near a sort of alliance and overcome China's relations with other regional partners. And finally, North Korea, another case in point, which is that China sort of don't want North Korean regime to fall. But at the same time, China does not provide anything further than that. Particularly, China don't want to see a nuclearized peninsula that will harm China's overall regional security. So China has been working with the US on this issue. And if Trump administration is willing, we can continue to work, again, coming back to the negotiation table, continue to work with the United States. Many of the things that China started, for instance, in the United Nations Security Council and in other areas that oppose US proposal is because in those negotiations, the United States didn't come to terms or didn't want to sort of fulfill its part end of the deal with North Koreans, with the Iranians, so that China has to do something. For instance, the United States signed a deal, JCPOA with Iran, and also the United States negotiated with the North Korean government trying to reach a deal. However, because of the shifting of government in this country, in the United States, it didn't go through or reversed backwards. So that's why I think China wanted to see the United States be more consistent so that China and US can work together on some of those issues. Finally, on what's happening in Gaza, in Israel, I think there's no consensus even in this country, right? And what the Hamas did to Israeli people, civilians, is horrible, and China condemned that. However, what Israeli military and the government is doing to the people in Gaza is also unforgivable. So in that respect, I think China's position in that Middle East conflict is respected by most of the Arab countries and respected by the world. So again, coming back to our original proposition, I don't think there is an increasing cooperation among those four countries. And China, again, have much better relationship with many more countries in the world. And China will continue to execute in a more independent and sovereign diplomatic relations with other countries. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Before we turn to Q&A with the broader audience, I want to ask a couple of questions. Maybe I'll first ask each of you a question to challenge some of your underlying arguments, and then I have some follow-up questions. Zhao, I guess one pointed question for you is, if we took the phrase axis out of the proposition and just said China is increasingly working with Russia, Iran, and North Korea to push back against the US-led West, would that change your views on this, and would you still push back against that? And then, Andrea, I wanted to hone in on one of the arguments that you made, which is, I think, quite an interesting one, which is that because Xi Jinping has consolidated so much power, he's more willing to take risks and to accept some of the cost associated with working with these countries. But one of the things we heard from some of our other panelists this morning, I believe it was Professor Zhao, said that, because of China's economic headwinds at home, there's maybe this tendency in the coming years for China to be a bit more inward-looking and maybe a little bit more cautious in some of its actions abroad. Do you see that as being the case, and do you think that may shift the way that Beijing approaches these axis or these other countries? So I'll leave it to those two questions for now.
Okay. No, I think even if you take out axis, this proposition still don't stand because it's very simple. Country-to-country relations are multifaceted. On a certain level, for instance, those four countries share common interests, which is under US sanction or when the US is going too far or not fulfilling its own obligations. So in that respect, those four countries may have a common ground to oppose the United States or US-led West. However, in many other areas, as I stated before, on regional stability, on denuclearization, on a more closer economic cooperation, on the support of current trading system and global governance, in many aspects, I don't think these four countries share common ground. And again, I would argue that China shares more common ground with many developing countries or global south on the issue of, for instance, climate change, on non-traditional security. And also, if you look at China's top project, the BRI, China has many other closer relationship with many other countries that are willing to cooperate with China on those issues. So again, picking out those four countries, I would argue, is very much a US bias. It's not reality. Thank you.
Okay, on your question, so does an inward, maybe more cautious or more vulnerable domestically China need these countries in the same way? And I guess I would argue that yes, then those relationships are just as important in that case as well, because the overarching imperative or objective for China is to undermine US power and influence, but probably the point before that is even regime stability. And China well understands that Russia, along with these other countries, have no interest in meddling in domestic affairs, and actually repression and other support that they can provide can help secure the regime domestically. So I think that kind of China that maybe is facing greater headwinds will look to relations with Russia, but also Iran and North Korea to help offset some of its vulnerabilities. It will look to them to try to insulate them more fully from US economic tools of coercion, especially if this is happening at a time where US confrontation is rising. And it will use relations with those countries to also help with power projection and to continue to demonstrate its willingness to confront the United States. I mean, one of the things that we didn't talk about also are some of these joint patrols and military drills that they've done with Russia. That is another way that China and Russia, again, are working together to try to signal their willingness to take on the United States. And so the joint bomber patrol that they did into Alaskan airspace was the first instance of Russia and China taking off from the same base, which again demonstrates the importance and the deepening cooperation that is now enabling new forms of cooperation. But so China that's facing headwinds is going to have to rely more, again, to offset vulnerabilities and to use these countries to help them project power. It also can be a useful tool in some of the asymmetric tactics that China might need to rely on more at a time of weakness. And again, this is another area where we've seen growing cooperation, perhaps between Russia and China, with Chinese participation, at least in close proximity to cables that have been cut in the Baltic Sea, with the Chinese ship, the Nunu Polar Bear, being in very close proximity to a Russian ship at that time. So it does appear that there's also growing cooperation in some of these hard to attribute tactics. And again, a China that's facing headwinds may rely more heavily on these tactics. And in those cases, again, Russia, but also Iran and North Korea are very useful in advancing some of these asymmetric tools.
Thank you both. I may have one more quick question, and before I turn to the audience, because I'm sure we have a lot. But I think one question that, just as a thought experiment, is what perhaps would be one or two key developments that if we were to see them would lead you to change your thinking about this? So for Andrea, what would make you think maybe this is less of an axis or there's less cooperation than we currently think? And Zhao, same, the reverse for you.
I mean, this doesn't necessarily have to do with the China piece of it, but I've also been spending a lot of time on the Russia-Iran relationship and trying to think through what a weakened Iran now means in the Russia-Iran relationship in particular. So if there were increasing activity targeting Iran from the Israelis, from the US, and Russia stays totally on the sidelines, again, that raises questions about how far these countries are willing to go in order to support one another. I don't know if it would totally convince me that it wasn't an axis, in large part given the ongoing war in Ukraine. Russia is bogged down and certainly has a lack of capacity to help in a very meaningful way. But I would be paying close attention to how far and what Russia was willing to do to address an embattled Tehran.
Well, I want to emphasize one aspect in this, back and forth argument, which is that China is a neighboring country to both Russia and North Korea. And we had troubles historically, and we wanted to maintain peace and stability along the very long border between, for instance, China and Russia. Like in this country, United States is bordering with Canada, right? You don't want that bilateral relationship to go south because you don't want to deploy millions of troops to the north of the border. But historically, yeah, that's the new development unexpectedly. But historically, Russia and China both deployed millions of troops against each other, right? And even border clashes. So I think for China, if you take out all the other factors, it's very important to maintain good relations with its neighbors, particularly Russia. So that's why when the war broke out, I think China has made an argument, particularly to our European neighbors, that we don't want to pressure Russia too much because we don't want to destabilize this regime. We don't want to, have going back historically to a very bad relationship, so that we will have a lot of problems, cross-border problems, not only security but also non-traditional problems like organized crime or the trafficking, of other things, and also that applies to North Korea. We don't want to have an immigration, crisis. We don't want to have a humanitarian crisis along our borders, and also particularly we don't want to have a nuclear crisis because North Korea has been testing nuclear weapons along the Chinese border. So bilaterally, it's very important to maintain that relationship. Again, that does not mean that overall this is going to be an axis or alliance. To your question, Brian, I think the only factor that uniting those countries together, again, is the United States. If the U.S. wanted going further and further to pressuring particularly China and Russia at the same time, thinking that China and Russia is gunning up against the U.S. interest and misrepresent China's international, global intentions, that will deteriorate the relationship and really pushing them to get closer and intensifying their cooperation in many aspects. But so far, and particularly when President Trump coming, I don't think that will happen in the short run.
Thank you both. And with that, I'll turn to audience questions. I see one here. Well, let's maybe take three. I see another one here, and then one back here.
I find very interesting the exchange. Thank you. I learned a lot. I want to ask a question to Professor Zhao. Your statement was that this relationship between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea is an American analysis bias. And I was wondering if bias means, in this case, in your thinking, that there is a nuclear and national security bias, because these countries are nuclear countries. Iran is near nuclear, right? It's not for certain. So there is a bias. This is the kind of bias that you mean, or can you explain better what you mean by bias?
Okay.
Good afternoon. Pavlo Zvonogorодski, Georgetown University, and I have a question for Dr. Kendall-Taylor. So we now see that the new American administration is trying to compel Russia to the negotiation table and to negotiate some kind of ceasefire in Russia's brutal war against Ukraine. But Russia is obviously very reluctant to do so, and one of the reasons is that it has been receiving this tremendous amount of technological and material support from China. So what do you think the new American administration could do? What tools could they utilize to press China or to incentivize China to limit their support? Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful discussion. The rules-based world has been a critical point for U.S.-China relations, and the provision of global public goods is strategically important for both sides to obtain peace over this world. And my only question is, how can both the USA and China obtain more strategic understanding and consensus towards Taiwan security and the Korean Peninsula? Thank you.
Okay. All right, I'll go first. First, to your question, I don't necessarily understand your question, but I think you are asking me whether or not, what do I mean by bias? I think it's, I think in the United States, there are two thoughts, my understanding. One is that some people in this country want to see the emergence of this axis of upheaval or axis of evil, because then they have a target. Then they can mobilize and act against this so-called axis of evil, right? Increasing their military expenditure, convincing their allies that they can, tightening their control of the alliance system. And that's pretty much what's been stated by the previous Biden administration when they want to reinforce their own China accusing of, Cold War-like alliance in the region and around the globe. So I think that's one camp. And the other camp is that they worry that those four countries are going to move towards that goal. And they wanted to disrupt that process. And one thinking is that how to drive a wedge between China and Russia in particular, and then turn Russia against China so that the United States can encircle China. But either way, I think, again, my argument is it's very consistent, is that is not reality. That is not what China is thinking. That is not what China's foreign policy is based upon. So no matter what, it's just serving American interest or a sort of particular vision for the United States towards those four countries. And in terms of nuclear states, I don't think that globally we recognize either Iran or North Korea as nuclear state from a legal perspective. And even if those countries have nuclear weapons, there are many other countries, India, Pakistan, or Israel also have nuclear weapons. I don't know if that's, have any impact on whether or not those four countries stand together.
And Andrea, I think that second question was for you, and I wanted to turn the third question about Taiwan a little bit fit into this panel by asking, one of the growing concerns here in Washington is about the risk of opportunism between the partners or opportunities for dual contingencies or risks that may pose to the U.S. So I'm wondering if you could just speak to some of your thoughts on, how China's relationship with these other partners may factor into, concerns about Taiwan or Taiwan contingency and things like that.
Okay, so how can we press China to kind of reduce its support to Russia? Obviously, this is a question that the Biden administration was grappling with and recognizing that you have to kind of thread the needle because you do too little, you create a permissive environment for this to happen, you prolong the war, you press too hard, and are we going to, again, create conditions that are pushing Russia and China closer together? So that's kind of the conundrum that I think policymakers have been grappling with. But so there are other ideas that are circulating out there. One is that you kind of start to hold Beijing responsible for the behaviors of its partners, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. I find that to be a fairly compelling argument. The secondary sanctions one is the one that's been talked about the most and I think could re-emerge, particularly if President Trump finds himself trying to build and create more leverage in a negotiation. Because I think the most important thing you said is that Putin is not ready to negotiate. He believes he's winning on the battlefield. And so I do think over time you will see President Trump searching for ways to create additional leverage in this negotiation because he's not going to want to look weak. And so things like secondary sanctions on China might work. Europe is another kind of avenue that people have talked about. How can we compel the Europeans to take a harder line on China so that China understands that there are costs that come? That may be more difficult under a Trump administration, given that we're talking about a trade war and other things. But I do think that this incoming administration is going to be looking for ways to bring Europe along to pursue a harder line on China. And so given that this is a war on their continent, maybe one direction that the European states are more willing to go. And then I think but recognizing, I think that there will be limits on what we can do, given my understanding of how kind of committed China is to supporting Russia in the war. And so thinking of ways, well, how do you mitigate the impact of things that they're doing, creating greater headwinds? That's another way. And then on your question on opportunism, so I, again, being a Russia-Europe person, don't know the contingency in Taiwan, but we are definitely working on that in the other direction. And I would argue that if the United States were engaged in the Indo-Pacific, it would be incredibly tempting for President Putin to try to poke and prod and test NATO at that moment, understanding that the US might not have the bandwidth or the resources to come to NATO's defense in the same way. I actually think it's the most likely scenario that you could see a direct Russia-NATO war. But it is preventable. If the United States is engaged, there's a whole set of capabilities, the enablers, air-to-air refueling, tankers, certain ranges of munitions and other things that would be sent to the Indo-Pacific. And so we have to be working with our European allies to be sure that they're investing in those capabilities that would be channeled to the Indo-Pacific so that we can be sure we maintain the credibility of our conventional deterrence in that instance.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
I think that's precisely what you would do to actually intensify the cooperation between China and Russia, because China did not want to go there, but because the United States is trying to bring NATO into our region, or we call it a globalization of NATO, or to try to set up a NATO-like alliance in the Asia-Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, that is intensifying China's worry or concern of its own security in the region. And in that respect, if China cannot sort of push back alone, then China needs help. And the only help would probably come from Russia. And that's very much the reason why when the war broke out in Ukraine, many Chinese sympathized with the Russian position because they think NATO, particularly the United States, is pushing too hard against Russia and harming Russia's national security. So I don't think that's a wise move on the US side, trying to, pushing some sort of arm race or alliance race in the Indo-Pacific region and locking China and the United States in a security dilemma.
Just to clarify, though, what I was talking about is getting European allies to invest in European defense. And so it wouldn't, not asking them to do more in the Indo-Pacific, but really telling our European allies and partners, you have to do more for your own security and defense. And if we are engaged in the Indo-Pacific, these are going to be the type of capabilities that will be in short supply. Russia will understand those gaps and vulnerabilities, and so the Europeans have to plug them in Europe. And so the point is we have to be able to maintain the credibility of our conventional deterrence in Europe so that it is not kind of a moment of temptation for Putin if something is happening in the Indo-Pacific.
We do have time for one more question up here on the front row.
Thank you. Zhao Long from Shanghai Institute for International Studies. My question goes to Andrea. I think there's quite strong argument back in China is that the concept of axis is quite similar to a so-called idea of global east, which trying to or attempt to isolate China from other global south countries and developing world. So many people believe that the argument you mentioned are not quite convincing because you also acknowledge that there's a lack of multilateral interactions between those four countries. The economic sector, I think China's economic tie with U.S. and its allies is much stronger than our economic relation with Russia and DPRK and Iran. China holds a quite different view on the reform of current existing world order than Russia's demand to rebuild it. So please help me to think through how could we place those four quite different, completely different bilateral relations into the general, formulated framework of access. Thank you.
Yes, based on the discussions of this debate and the back and forth, it makes me to believe that what we're really talking about here, China, is more a transactional activities rather than alliances. Because it seems to me that because of the economic situation of China, now they want to leverage their exports. They're trying to get alliances, not alliances, but business around the world. And this is very different of course, they want to sell their oil, they want to sell their instruments, their trucks, whatever they want to export. And for them, it's business, so whether it's Iran, whether it's Russia, whether it's the Middle East. And I would like a comment on that because based on the back and forth, it doesn't convince me either way, other than business is business, period.
Zhao, maybe that first question may be for you, and then Andrea, maybe that sparked a question for me, does China maybe seem more or less transactional than some of the other partners in these relationships, just from looking at all four of them overall? So just quickly on those two questions.
I'll be very brief. I think, if we're still in that hyper-globalization age, maybe business is as usual, business is business. But today, business is very much interrupted by geopolitics. So we can't conduct business as usual. China wanted to have a more open and free trade in today's world, but we all seen the rising of protectionism, of economic nationalism around the globe. And that is also the consequences of globalization. So again, we can't do business as usual. But there are still, why China focused on global south? Because there are still many developing countries who want to have development, want to have the opportunity of trading with big countries like both the United States and China. So China does not only sort of focused on export, but also focused on import from those countries and increase bilateral trade with many of the countries in the world. But that goes back to my original argument, which is that right now, China is still very much a developing country if you look at per capita income, right? And China still has a far way to go to catch up with the developed countries. That's why China is still focused on development. And that's why China does not want to have any sort of geopolitical alliance that is harming its own own economic interest. That doesn't make any sense to China. So that's why I think that proposition for today is not standing on itself.
And Andrea, to you. And then I think we do have one final question from Bonnie.
Great. Okay, a couple of, I don't know, disjointed points on the lack of, I guess I go back to the original thing that I started my statement with on what is an axis. And obviously we're all struggling with what exactly it is. It's not an alliance. And we shouldn't apply the criteria of the way that the United States has alliances with interoperability and all of those things. Just because those relationships and partnerships look a little bit different than the United States' relationships with its closest allies doesn't mean that those relationships, I would say, are any less consequential, because at the end of the day, they really are less isolated, less vulnerable. They're working together to offset vulnerabilities and enhance their military capabilities. And so, again, the way that Mussolini used it is, collaborating on troubles. They have a powerful motivation, and their kind of collective energies are all radiating in the same direction, and that is towards the United States and undermining the current international order as it exists today. So I guess I would consider that an axis. And it kind of goes to your question about business as usual. I mean, there's a transactional nature about it. A lot of the military cooperation is in areas where I have one thing, you have another, and it's driven by that kind of pragmatic exchange. But at the end of the day, I do think that they share this joint view of undermining the United States and reordering the rules of the world. And that therefore kind of it amounts to something more. They have a strong imperative, even when they do have diverging interests, again, to compartmentalize those interests because they have this overarching objective of taking on the United States. And if you just think back throughout history of previous iterations of these axes, Germany, I mean, they were very different ideologically, they were very transactional, and yet they had tremendous capacity to do damage to the United States and the global order as it existed. So part of, I think, my answer is just, they don't have to be aligned on every instance. They don't have to share an ideology, although I do think that that's coming. And that one last point is, when there's been instances throughout history where you've had shifts from a unipolar to a competing order world, the emerging order always begins as something of an opposition. It's clear what it wants to tear down. And it's only after many, many years do they kind of unite around what a shared vision of the future looks like. And so I guess that would be my argument, is where we're headed. Yes, we know very much what they oppose and what they are against. And I would argue that you're starting to see the semblance of the way that they would want a future order to work. And they are working through some multilateral institutions, especially BRICS. And I get that it's a kind of collection. It has India and Brazil and other countries that don't want to oppose. But these international institutions are very useful venues for socializing and spreading kind of your vision of the world. It's clear that you just in Kazan had the biggest BRICS summit that we've seen to date. It's clear there's overarching discontent in the rest of the world, and these countries are are increasingly looking to kind of tap into that, I think, and collaborate in ways that can advance their own objectives.
Yeah, Bonnie.
Sorry, I don't mean to weigh in too much, but I just wanted to mention, so our team has been working with Andrea to explore this question from the China angle. And Andrea's point about all three actors supporting Russia and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a clear example for whether it's intentional or consequential supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But one example that Zhao, I'd love to get your thoughts on is our team obviously follows very closely China's military activities, and we couldn't help notice in China's October 2024 exercise, Joint Sword 2024B, in that exercise, we saw China working with Russia on the margins, and then the Chinese ships coming to that exercise. At the same time, in a very uncharacteristic move, we saw your foreign minister call his Iranian counterpart. The next day, we saw North Korea engage in provocative activities, including bombing a road connecting to South Korea. Now, all of this could be just coincidental within 24 hours of each other, but I think these are sort of the types of evidence data that we're looking at to see, is there something there? And I'd love your thoughts on that.
Good job, Bonnie.
Yeah, you're helping one side, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Again, I just want to make this argument that is intention and consequences are very different things. China has no intention of sort of allying with or working with those countries trying to intentionally break down the current international system. What you mentioned on a tactical level may be true, from American perspective, but again, those are not coordinated and intentional military action trying to testing the U.S. Military sort of operational network in the Western Pacific. And again, I want to remind you that China's particular military action against the Taiwan independent forces is trying to signal to both the United States and Taiwan that it's very dangerous to further its agenda on sort of secessionist moves. It's not in particular trying to, again, using that military operation to undermine and dismantle the international system that actually China is a part of. So again, there are many different activities going on at the same time, but I don't want us to sort of misunderstand and misrepresent each other's moves so that makes things even worse, because then we have less trust with each other, we have more suspicion of the other's activities, and we're deeply locked up in this security dilemma and trying to escalate our deterrence against each other. And now you're not only escalate deterrence from the US side against China, but you want to escalate that deterrence against this whole group of nations. And if that's true, then you need to actually reinforce your own alliance in the region. And again, I wanted to say this, and that is in danger of forcing Chinese leadership to think about the possibility of aligning with more countries that have shared interest against the U.S. Yeah.
Great. Well, with that, we're already slightly over time on this panel. So I want to give you, if you want any final remarks. If not, we can move into voting, but I'm happy to.
I'm good. I just want one or two people vote for me. Thank you.
Well, I think we'll now move into our post-debate poll, and Truly can give instructions for again, it was very close last time. I wrote down, I think, 51% in favor and 49 against the proposition. So we'll see how things have shifted.
Great. Either type in the URL on the left-hand side or scan the QR code on the right-hand side. If you need any help, please just raise your hand.
Okay. You're coming back.
Where's your camera?
Interesting. Moved a lot. Wow. I think Zhao may have been compelling. Although I think this is a really fascinating debate, and I think shows the lack of a consensus so far yet in terms of these conversations. So I think there's a lot of interest that'll be on this topic going forward. So I want to thank you both so much for your willingness. Thank you, everybody.
All right, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final panel of the day. It's a delight to be able to wind up this day of debates with a conversation and perhaps a debate or with different points of view, but this final discussion is not structured as a formal debate with a specific proposition that you are going to vote on. Instead, we'll ask you at the end to vote on what was the best panel of the day, and if you're still in the room...
Your choice will be this one.
Exactly. You're going to vote for us, and we will win the debate. I'm Scott Kennedy. I'm Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics here at CSIS, and it's a delight to see all of you here in person and everybody watching online, and it's also an honor to be collaborating with Bonnie Lin and the China Power team for these debates, which they've run annually for several years now. And it's an honor, again, to be able to participate and talk about issues which all of the programs at CSIS and the Washington policy community cares about. For this afternoon's session, we're going to talk about the U.S., China, and economic security. And trying to figure out a way into this topic is not easy. We could come up with some proposition, but it'd probably be some sort of straw man. Is the U.S. or China more or less dangerous in how they use economic security? And I think what we wanted to do is have what may sound like a nerdy or boring or thoughtful conversation, despite the fact that we're in Washington, D.C. Let's try. We're going to succeed because we have two of the world's leading experts on economic security issues sitting next to me. I want to briefly introduce both of them and then jump into the program. To my immediate left is Matt Turpin, who is a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he is also a senior advisor with Palantir Technologies. From 2018 to 2019, Matt served on the National Security Council as Director for China and Senior Advisor on China to the Secretary of Commerce. He served for over 22 years in the U.S. Army in a whole variety of different combat units in the U.S., Europe, and the Middle East. And he also was an assistant professor of history at West Point. He, from 2013 to 2017, served as an advisor on the People's Republic of China to the chairman and vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon, and was assigned to assist with one of the earliest reports, I think, on economic security, although I don't think it had that title at the time, with the Defense Innovation Initiative. And from 2010 to 2013, he was Chief of Crisis Planning at U.S. Pacific Command in Honolulu. To his left, at the other end of the table, is Dr. Zhao, who is a professor at the School of International Studies in the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development at Peking University. His school has hosted me on numerous visits to Beijing, and I have had innumerable excellent conversations with Professor Zhao. His areas of expertise include international political economy and China's international economic relations, particularly in the field of energy and natural resources. But his knowledge runs quite wide and quite deep. He has done extensive research on the political and social risk management for Chinese companies who operate internationally. His PhD is from the University of Hawaii, and he also overlapped in Honolulu. Although not necessarily, I don't know if it's the exact same time, but they've both lived in Honolulu. But he's also had research and teaching positions in the United States, Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So with these two very wise gentlemen with us today, I thought we'd proceed in this manner. Is first just have a conversation about what the heck is economic security. It is a very popular word now. It was even in the president's initial executive order on the America First trade strategy. And I now work in the Department of Economic Security and Technology here at CSIS. And so it is the word of 2025. So let's first try to understand what the heck we're talking about. And then we'll talk about what the US and China have been doing to protect their economic security, ways in which the other side feels that the other side has gone too far or abused economic security. What's that mean for the rest of the world and global institutions like the WTO? And then let's look forward in the final few minutes about where are we going with economic security? Is it to a world of greater security or greater insecurity? And what might we do to try and have a more constructive outcome? So that's the plan for this hour. So let me first turn to Matt to ask you about your thoughts about what is economic security. I'll give you just sort of my very thumbnail sketch so far, is that it's efforts to advance the economic elements of security and ensure the security of our economic foundations. So the word in both directions. And I think of sort of like 8 ways in which this comes up: technological leadership, supply chain resilience, critical infrastructure, data security, having a stable financial system, stable and reliable energy resources, having sufficient human capital, food security, and lastly, avoiding economic coercion by adversaries. How does that sound as a definition to you, or how's it evolved in your mind? As I mentioned, you did some of the earliest work for the US government thinking about economic security issues, and over the last decade, how have you begun to think about it?
Sure, and thanks, Scott. Really appreciate you and Bonnie asking us out here to participate in this, and for me to come out and join everybody on a snowy afternoon. Hopefully, everyone is able to get home safe. I first encountered the term economic security really from my Japanese counterparts when I worked at the White House. So, under Shinzo Abe, and the creation of sort of an economic security portfolio within the National Security Secretariat and the broader sort of Japanese thinking about what was going on. And I thought that it was a good broad term to cover many of the things that I had been struggling with and many of my counterparts have been struggling with for a number of years across the US government that we couldn't quite put our fingers on. And so I sort of retroactively applied that term economic security back in time over the things that I had sort of run through. So maybe and I think, Scott, your rundown of the different sort of domains in which this covers is absolutely right. But maybe I'll take it up a level to sort of like, how did we get to this position where we're having, like, in 2018 or so, we are like thinking about the term economic security and we hadn't been thinking about it before. And I think it comes from, as we came to the end of the Cold War and we began to sort of birth a new international sort of economic system, we largely assumed that security was not a part of that, right? So what would happen in the trade and the economic and the commercial and the industrial space was sort of post-geopolitical, right? That this was an area in which it would be governed by a set of rules and norms. We had an international institution, the WTO, that we had birthed in the mid-1990s that would serve as a sort of the adjudicator of this. And it meant that things that had been quite difficult and contentious for nation states to have to deal with, we could suddenly park it underneath a normative system. And in doing so, we would take out a lot of the heat and light that had come from those sorts of things, and we could sort of settle into sort of normalized relations that would get towards mutual benefit and allow for sort of positive sum games to take place, right? That's what the assumptions were. I think that's a noble effort and that folks were sort of deeply committed to it, not only in the United States, but around the world. And I think we had partners sort of everywhere who understood that concept and how they would do that. And I think what we found certainly by, a decade to a decade and a half after China's entry into the WTO, is that there was a lot of stresses on that system. Because some of the assumptions we had made about China's accession to the WTO and the kinds of things that would happen didn't necessarily play out. And it began to open up real concerns inside places like the United States, but also in Tokyo and other places, that the economic domain and the sort of the domain of international trade and commercial activity and industrial activity was becoming an area, again, of geopolitical competition, and that we needed to then take action in that space, that it was incumbent upon us to figure out what that is, and to begin to take action on that. And so therefore, many of the tools that had been, that we had used in an earlier time, whether that is things like tariffs, things like export controls, investment screening and investment restrictions, all things that this normative system was to sort of bring down to an absolute minimum, suddenly are then being applied again, and we're having to think through how to use them again. And to me, where we found ourselves is that, certainly by 2018, 2019, the slogan "economic security is national security" was becoming sort of widely accepted in ways that in 2000 or in 2010 would have been seen as sort of odd and misplaced. And so it suggested that there had been a change that had happened during that time. And while I think that this was a dynamic process in which both countries are sort of doing this at the same time, because certainly Beijing is going through these same sorts of concerns, this is what gets us to an adoption of this concept and these sets of terms, and then the use of these tools in a U.S. concept, in a U.S. scenario. So that's kind of where I think we're at.
That's very helpful engagement of the question about what the heck are we talking about and how did we get here? And you told a very nice, very carefully refined story about that. Let me turn to Dao Jiong and your sense of how comfortable you are with this kind of definition of economic security and the story that Matt told about the evolution of why it's become so much more salient in the world as a result of expectations about the post-Cold War era that were not met.
The notion of economic security is context-based. Earlier, Matt mentioned Japan, and my understanding of how that manifested in Japan in the late 60s with the Suzuki administration was, number one, to spend less than 1% on defense and sort of outsource that defense spending to the US, which led to the US-Japan dispute, part of the reason for the dispute in the 1980s. A second was a focus on resources, securing resources overseas, including actually that Japanese understanding of economic security was a major reason for Japan to normalize relationship with China in 1972, 7 years earlier than the United States did. A third was to make friends with as many countries as possible. Japanese passport holders were allowed to go to virtually every country in the world except North Korea, and Japan would be providing consular protection of Japanese citizens. Now, why do I mention that? There is a bit of a mirror image in Chinese understanding of economic security, or what you call the Japanese 综合安全, what we call 综合安全观, SOGO.
Comprehensive framework of security.
In Japanese, 综合安全 in Chinese. But certainly in China, we don't have the luxury of limiting defense spending to less than 1% and resource exploration overseas and of course, Chinese citizens everywhere in the world, and what we call overseas interest. But more fundamentally, my understanding of that you can trace Chinese understanding of economic security actually going back to Dr. Sun Yat-sen's articulations. And when you look at history, there is a good deal of continuity in economic and foreign policy making between the nationalist government during the final years of the Sino-Japanese War and the founding years of the People's Republic. Fast forward is that in the mid-1990s, what people missed and learning about was during the 15 years when China sought membership in the WTO, there was a very strong domestic opposition to it. Academics, Chinese academics had an analogy about joining the WTO, saying this was going to be dancing with the wolf being the WTO, right? So if you just look at the literature, there was a lot of Chinese writing saying getting into the WTO was going to be a threat to China's economic security. But certainly the leadership took the decision very differently. Now, it's useful to put that understanding or that complaint about the WTO in the domestic context in a different context, with some substance, because one of the China's strategies in the earlier years of reform was to grant concessions, tax holidays to foreign investors. Actually, it was not until January 1st, 2013, when the foreign investment FDI companies and domestic companies were asked to pay the same corporate income tax, because prior to that, domestic companies were asked to pay on average 30%, and foreign companies were asked to pay 15%, and that was standardized only in the beginning of 2013. So there is a long context, and of course we can go on and on, we can do a textbook understanding of that. I want to end this by offering a point of advice, especially to students. Scott earlier mentioned the 综合安全观 that is associated with the Chinese Communist Party, especially since the 18th session. But if you heard what I had just said, what's said, the fundamental element, as I understand, in the comprehensive approach, or what I think is better translated as holistic approach to security, is that development is a foundation of for security, and security is a guarantee for development. It sounds a little bit dialectical in the Chinese way, but nevertheless, it suits a domestic historical context, and it's not meant to be, let's say, a denial or a rebuttal of the same vocabulary of economic security or other forms of security in other contexts.
Super helpful. I want to ask one more sort of general question before we dive into the US and China. And I think at some point we're going to open to questions on the floor, right? Okay, super. So you all get your questions that you're thinking, and those who are watching online, you can type in your questions and they'll be forwarded to me right to the back of my brain, and I'll be sure to utter exactly as you type. So there are a couple controversies around economic security in general. I want to ask you about two of them. The first is about interdependence, because as you mentioned, we're in a very globalized economy, significant amounts of trade bilaterally between the US and China, and it turns out that on security issues, we are on the different sides of a whole variety of different issues. And so people have talked about the issue of weaponized interdependence. And I'm curious that's the first one is, because interdependence used to be seen as the solution to a lot of problems, and now it's seen as the source of a lot of problems. And I'm wondering where you two stand on that. The second is about tools to manage economic security in general, and we've generally divided those into two types, particularly when you're talking about technology leadership. One is make the other guy slow down the other guy, put restrictions on them, limit their access, reduce your vulnerabilities from them. And the other is what they call run faster. So we love to use running and stadium analogies here at CSIS. And so what is your thought about the relative strengths and benefits of strengthening one's own capabilities versus slowing down the other part? So first side, weaponized interdependence, second, tools. Matt, why don't we go with you and then Zhao.
Yeah, so I think this debate over interdependence, is it a good that leads to greater sort of peace and prosperity, or is it a vulnerability that needs to be addressed? Obviously that changes as countries move from a perception of partnership to one of rivalry, and I think that it's clear that is sort of the transition that certainly the United States and the PRC have gone through over the last couple of years, is this transition from a partnership to a rivalry, which makes those things that had been seen as positives in the relationships, i.e. you have mutual vulnerabilities to each other, that those things are seen as wanting to move to reducing your vulnerability to the other while increasing the other's dependence on you, right? And so that's the logical play that you would take, is that you'd seek to reduce just reduce your dependence on your rival while you make your rival more dependent on you, right? But in sort of a dynamic situation which you have two competitors and each one is following that same approach, that means that in a relative sense, you have less interdependence, right? Because each is going to pull away, right? Yes, each would like to make the other more vulnerable, make more dependent on them, but obviously that's kind of what it's going to mean, right? And so I think that's the dynamic we find ourselves in, and I think it's a product of this wider slide into rivalry. And then the other one would be then on tools, I've had a really hard time over the years conceptualizing this either run fast or slow down the other, right? This offense or defense. Because I come from the world of team sports, right? And in team sports, it isn't, should I score more points or should I prevent the other side from scoring points? It's yes, both, right? You do both, right? You have to both score your own points and you have to also prevent your rival from scoring points. So you're going to do those things and you're going to use those things and create those things in a common strategy. It is not an either or strategy. And that's the dynamic I think that we have to sort of wrestle with. And then of course, our system, CSIS is a great place for it. Is there going to be debates about whether are we doing the defense good enough? Are we doing the offense good enough? Or is this the right balance? And those are all worthy things to do. But the reality is you need both.
Zhao?
Interdependence is a reality to live with. It's not a choice. It's neither good or bad, or positive or negative. But in the China-US context, we are today at a stage when we have to wrestle with the persistence of parallel narratives. It's very comfortable, or at least fashionable, if not comfortable, to frame everything in a binary mode, whether it's history or it's technology or what else. I'm reminded by an episode of a conversation between Premier Zhou Enlai and Richard Nixon in Hangzhou when they tried to, they agreed on the premises for resuming contacts between the two governments, saying, well, actually the two countries are in a parallel relationship, not adversarial, certainly not directly opposing each other. That parallel nature of this is that, yeah, they took different paths, different governing systems, different stages, and certainly different needs from each other, but at the end of the day, they both want to have prosperity for their own people and peace for the world, although the methodologies can be different. I think that's useful. So if we accept that between China and the US, technology or whatnot, in terms, as a parallel relationship, I would think it's useful or necessary to reject A is friendly or unfriendly or good or bad. It's a mix of different, let's say, a mixture of resources. China holds for the US, US holds for China. I could put a short list of 4. One is, a source of prosperity. And second, it's a source of uncertainty. A third is a source of anxiety. And the fourth is a source of unpredictability. Out of all this, I would think each society, each governing body, the real competition is in self-reflection, is in introspection, self-change, and although rhetorically, for political reasons, it's difficult to admit that one is going the way of the other. Now, asking about tools, especially on technology, gosh, run faster, hit harder. I hope China would one day have that unique choice America can afford to have. We can't afford that. We have very weak in technology, and we have a long way of learning. In the technology race, it's happening every day, right? So, number one solution as a tool is to practice self-help or self-strengthening. And second is to adapt. No, self-help is different from self-reliance, right? You still open. Second is that you adapt. Adapt meaning you don't just accept the vertical integration. Sometimes you work towards a horizontal integration with whatever technology systems you can lay your hands on. The third is to iterate. Iterate meaning, yes, you do need to work to make it simpler, make it cheaper, and diversify the applications. I would take TikTok and DeepSeek as examples of iteration rather than imitation, which, imitation would be an accepted strategy if you accept vertical integration of technologies, either in a domestic context or cross-national context as the proper choice. But iteration means, yes, please do go ahead and try to improve on it in ways that are feasible, at least however momentarily that is.
It is. You know what? It's super helpful. And I appreciate everyone going through what may sound like an Economic Security 101 conversation and seminar first. But I think because it's so new, and also because we want to make sure that we have some of the framework of the conversation before we jump in. But now it's time to jump into some of the specific things going on in the bilateral relationship. And I want to really ask both of you, given this framework that you've explained, sort of the evolution in history and things, is, you know, obviously both sides are deeply concerned about some of the economic security measures that the other have taken. Sometimes they think that they've used economic security as a excuse for industrial policy. Sometimes they think they've just they've sort of over-engaged in protecting their security at the expense of the other. And we've got a whole variety of different kinds of examples of this. On the Chinese side, you've got things from the Great Firewall to the idea of secure and controllable technology. On the US side, Matt was there at the origins when the US decided to focus heavily on 5G. And of course, we've imposed a variety of restrictions on semiconductors and stuff since. Matt, from your perspective, you know, where is China, where did they cross the line? Where did they go in efforts to protect their economic security that ended up really weakening or America's security, and also making it very difficult to find a way for the two governments and others to create boundaries and operate inside with sort of common principles? And then, Zhao, I'd like to hear your thoughts about, you know, where you feel the U.S. has gone too far. Is it small yard, high fence not being small yard, high fence, or those kinds of things? But let's start with Matt.
Yeah, so, and I'll just kind of comment on when I think it got the most sort of attention inside sort of the U.S. policy scene, and got really deep attention from sort of the U.S. business community, is really the unveiling of Made in China 2025 in 2015, a comprehension that if taken to its logical sort of ends of the industrial policy that Beijing had announced, that its efforts to move up the value chain of manufacturing would not only do enormous damage to the most productive and sort of prosperous sectors of the US economy, as well as the European economy and the Japanese economy, but would also call into question all of the sort of national security advantages that the United States maintained to be able to have a technological advantage. And so it was that sort of policy that really kicked off a set of discussions across the US policy system about how do we deal with this. And so, you know, if we take a look at, like, what time was that, right? So that's the last 2 years of the Obama administration. And of course, there are things that are also happening in the bilateral relationship and within the broader US-China relationship, you know, increasing tensions over South China Sea, you know, a history of increased tensions between Beijing and Tokyo. And so it's within that construct of an increasing concern around the potential for a real national security and military confrontation that might come in the future, and an understanding of what does this industrial policy, if taken to its ends, mean to that dynamic. And that is essentially, I think, what generated a set of decisions, you know, that were deeply sort of bipartisan, that the US has to take some actions, as opposed to what it had largely seen as not, resisting the securitization of the economic sphere and the trade sphere. It's what pushed folks into considering those tools that we really had not used since the Cold War, right? Whether it's export controls, whether it's really strict investment screening. Certainly we had already created a trade system that excluded the Soviet Union and its satellites with GATT, but so that was sort of not in the system of what we would be talking about. But it's those dynamics that really sort of drove us down a path, and I think that it's also on the back of nearly at that point in time 7 or 8 years of kind of continuous S&EDs of sitting down with our Chinese counterparts, laying out the real concerns that we'd had, and the things that we were seeing take place that sort of culminated in that industrial policy that then convinced folks that really we don't have partners on the other side of the negotiating table who are taking our concerns seriously, therefore we need to act.
I can't stop recalling an episode at Beida, my university, when one of the original authors, one of the very authors on the team from the Ministry of Science and Technology, the authors of that Made in China 2025 document. And he was very, very self-defensive about the document, because domestically you have a lot of people saying, well, look, that one document played such a powerful role in upsetting the Americans and everyone else around the world. Of course, you know, I can't be representing him. But on a more serious note, we see the background of that document differently in the domestic context. I'm not trying to be sympathetic, I'm just trying to be factual to the extent I can. One is that for the writers, they were probably taking insights from what was produced in Germany, Industrialization 4.0. If you look at German documents on that, there are a lot of similarities, right? If there was Industrialization 4.0, there were previous documents. And as you know, there are a lot of fascination in China about German approach to industry growth. And more broadly, 2015, we were having, you know, what's called a new normal. That's the beginning of slower growth. Now, how do you get out of the slow growth? You can't repeat the good old investment in what we say 铁公鸡, right? That would be the railroads, the highways, or the airports. You have to have some new source of growth. And along with that, you had the Belt and Road. And make no mistake about it, one of the domestic, at least vernacular justifications in the initial years of the Belt and Road was to help to use that as a route for dealing with some of the sunset productive capacity in China. So fine, that capacity is out, what's in? Then fine, we have to have some technological breakthroughs. Now that document certainly is short of the funding, the institutional arrangements for getting there, and also the other essential elements of industrial policy. By the way, industrial policy in English is a term that often inspires critical thinking or debate, but as a Chinese vocabulary, especially for those who are not schooled in public policy or political science or international studies, 产业政策, that's so normal. You just everything, let's get the industry going, that's it. Right or wrong, you know, public or private resource or international concerns that were at best secondary. So that's that. Now, there are many other aspects of industrial policy. Again, bear in mind, I would attribute what you said about I participate in many of the preparatory sessions for the S&ED, especially in the energy sector between the two governments in those years. What I often noticed is that especially when you have these conversations between the functional agencies of the government and the local government agencies, the first and foremost is that the interpreter never gets it. The interpreter gets probably 30 or 40% of what's said superficially. I understand the frustration on both sides. You know, people have expect we travel this way and the message delivered, but somehow it never gets lost. But in any case, there are natural, I would say, understandable differences. Let me very quickly address Scott's question about what the US might have gone, quote unquote, too far. There are many triggers. If I can relate one partly, to continue on the conversation from earlier today, I would think the GPS incident in 1997, wasn't it? When China, the mainland, was launching a live drill of missiles into the Taiwan Straits. I do believe. 96? That missile was guided by the US GPS system, right? For some minutes of the operation, or some seconds, the PLA noticed, my goodness, this guidance was turned off. Manually turned off, right?
Imagine that.
Yeah, I know, that was then. And that motivated them to start what's today known as the Beidou program, right? China's own navigation. There are longer stories to such episodes. Now, who did what first, cause and effect, that's for analysis. My personal grudge, this is very purely personal, but about the yard and fence approach is that increasingly it gets into biotech. And there are serious human rights issues here. Biotech, any tech can be dual use. Now, we have to be mindful once you start to apply a higher element of security or competition or reliance, put those conceptual elements here in, then you are really denying the opportunities for innovation in medicine, especially common use medicine, vaccines or whatnot, and then seeds, agricultural seeds investment. Biotech has a very large application, including some of the technologies, equipments, and data that's related to countering synthetic drugs. I'm talking about illegal drugs. You do need, for example, the nuclear magnetic spectrometers. That's biotech. But that technology has necessary use for legitimate production and analysis of foods, medicine, and everything else, including pollution of the water, but that can certainly be weaponized, in different contexts. And in relation to biotech, I would think the curtailment of basic student-to-student exchange, study opportunities, including basic science. I'm not talking about the top-notch. Every country has national security boundaries, but it does not make sense to restrict student exchange or faculty exchange or reduce. So on that note, I'm quite encouraged. I also myself, Scott and others, played positive roles in seeing the renewal of the frame umbrella agreement for science and technology cooperation between the two countries. Hopefully this will lead to a better future. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been an amazingly harmonious conversation. So I want to invite the audience colleagues here to help us see if we might be able to get to some specific issues which folks are a little bit concerned about, whether it's DeepSeek or AI in general or chips or other kinds of things that people are really interested in. Truly, as folks just bring them the mics, if you want to ask a question, please just raise your hand and we'll go there. I saw the gentleman with the dark glasses there. If you would just identify yourself and then keep your question to a question. And we'll collect several, and then so we won't go one by one, we'll collect a few questions. Yes?
Thank you, Scott, for such a wonderful discussion. My name is Emerson, and I used to be an intern with the Jimmy Carter Center of Atlanta. And currently I'm a DC-based talent security specialist and Mandarin Chinese expert. My only question is, in today's globally connected world, healthy competition and interconnectedness are inevitable. So how can United States of America and China find a healthy way to allow and also promote mutual interest in technology and global health? But another question is, how could these third-party actors, like commercial sectors, promote the rules-based order in terms of security, in terms of economic collaboration? These are 2 questions of mine. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Let's pick a couple more. Over on this side, any questions over here? We'll come right here, this woman in the front, second row.
Yes, my question, Dr. LG from CIFAI Private Sector. My question is, there has been a lot of hype about DeepSeek AI from China, but there is also the same with all the platforms here in the United States. But in reality, none of them are better or worse. So why all this, what I call nonsense about that, when none of them contribute anything positive that we already know in AI?
Okay, let's get one more. This gentleman back. Yes.
Thank you for giving me another chance to ask a question. My name is Lalo from Johns Hopkins CSIS. So my question is about economic data and its research. In recent years, accessing economic data from China has become increasingly difficult. So for example, a 2023 Financial Times report noted that the number of statistics published by the Chinese government in 2020 had fallen back to late 1990s levels. So it's like a 50% decline from its peak during the Hu Jintao's era. So at the same time, many of the official figures released by the Chinese government have been met with skepticism. For instance, Professor Yi Fuxian has questioned the accuracy of the China's population data. And the last year, economist Gao Shanwen raised concern about China's GDP growth figures at a seminar held by PIE. So given the increasing difficulties of accessing economic data and conducting field research in China, how can we better access the true fact of the Chinese economy from outside of the country? Thank you.
Okay. Why don't we have Dao Qiong go first this time, and then Matt.
I will answer the easiest one first, DeepSeek. My wife asked DeepSeek to write a story about myself. And half along the way, she said, no, this is going to take too long. Because DeepSeek actually showed her how it found all these things about me online first. That's one of the steps of DeepSeek, right? But in the end, she showed me, she wanted a 2,000-word story about me. That's one version of DeepSeek Daozhong, okay? Then she also wanted the 100-word version. I look at both. Both are nonsensical because take my name out or Beida, it can be anyone. I don't know more about DeepSeek, so I normally don't speak about this in general terms. Now, I guess you understood what I really said. It is a real life story. It's useful, but sometimes we have to put these innovative technologies in context. Of course, DeepSeek never wrote a story about my wife because she's not a public, her name was never recorded anywhere. That does not mean she does not have a worthy story to write, right? I guess you get what I was trying to get at. On data, many more things can be said, and you mentioned 2 individual names. I know both of them quite well. There is politics of data or release everywhere. But to put all these, what you said in a serious note, if you look at how and why the Chinese scientists recommended the government to stop sharing basic data about supercomputers. Because they found out you have all these rankings, right? That's normally an industry thing, basically among scientists. Then it became a source of sanctions. So they stopped it. Now, I'm not saying that's the only reason. There are concerns about transparency, what that leads to. All governments have certain gates on this. A second reason is, I would think, also understandable, right? I'm trying to be careful because we are in Washington, D.C. The general public has different reactions to different data, especially after certain revelations. What I'm really trying to say is that data, the quality of data, the sharing of the data, it probably deserves more structured conversations among the public policy and also the data scientists themselves. Global health can mean seriously different things. Quite unfortunately, thus far, global health is limited to preventing, the spread of pandemics across national borders. That's too limited. If anything, China's improvement in public health benefited greatly from a different American approach. 1844, the year 1844, between the US government and the Qing dynasty, that was the first treaty signed between the Qing dynasty and the foreign government. It was on health. That was signed at Wangsha in today's Macau. What was that? That was to introduce Western medical practice, surgery, right, into China. That's a different way of health, right? And there's a long history of philanthropy, the Rockefeller Foundation, Gates Foundation, Ford Foundation, in addition to NIH of the US and many other, cooperation in not just reproductive health in China. So we should be looking at this more seriously. And today there is a good chance for going beyond the bilateral context. 2013, you had a agreement between, the USAID, by the way, and Ministry of Commerce of China to cooperate on the health and other issues outside of the bilateral context. And then 2016, you had the completion of the Center for Disease Control, CDC, for the African Union in Addis. And the deal was China would be doing the building and the United States would be doing the staffing. Later on, China and America, would be doing the operations. Of course, things came to a stop in 2017. But that doesn't mean we cannot go back. These are the basic things because the CDC plays a very essential function in working at the roots, the disease surveillance, working at the roots of what eventually may become a epidemic locally or pandemic globally. So if I summarize this, it's a very serious topic, but it has to begin with what is the boundary. If the boundary is simply to say, you are the source of my trouble, my defense is at the border, keep your products, your tainted goods, possibly even your people out of my border, I'm safe. That's one way of looking at global health. Another way of looking at global health, including if you relate what I said earlier about biotech, is to say, let's work together to improve the general lot of public health in populations around the world. I'm not talking about philanthropy alone, because for that to work, it needs equity, it needs investment by the locals. I'm sorry, I kept spoke too long.
Okay, no worries. Matt?
Yeah, I think I wanted to connect sort of the restrictions on economic data to this question about interconnectivity and how do you maintain sort of the benefits of an interconnected world. And I think it's, that it makes it actually quite difficult. I mean, if you can't make sort of investment decisions based upon a real sort of trust in what the statistics are, what's the unemployment rate, what are the growth rates, what are these things look like? It's really difficult to see how you can maintain that kind of interconnectivity. And I think, we're gonna, we've watched, particularly in a number of sort of things like wireless technology and some other things, of agreeing upon global standards, and that certainly created then, a marketplace that allows for sort of all the providers to sell to a single global standard. I think historically that's a fairly unique arrangement, and I suspect that that's not the kind of thing that will continue necessarily into the future, right? I think you're going to see a much greater fracturing of sort of technological standards as each pursue their own areas, and I think we are going to be generally the poorer for that. But there are always these trade-offs that folks are having to deal with, and I think that that's the likely outcome. In terms of large language models, so DeepSeek being one example, I think what we are watching is the beginning of a new industry around artificial intelligence, and the beginnings of any new industry, whether we take ourselves back to, remember in the 1990s when everyone was like, what do you do with this internet thing? This internet webs sort of stuff, like, I mean, what does this actually do? I suspect that's the same kind of thing that we're in, is that we're very early in an industry, and it's not yet clear how it's going to be used and how it's going to be made into things that are sort of profitable. I mean, we are already watching commercial industries use these models across sort of countless internal operations. And I think that that's going to continue to sort of take shape. And we don't yet know what the right business model is for how to set it up. So we've got a bunch of different companies that have come out with things. I think DeepSeek has done some very impressive work, but it's not yet clear that we have what the model is.
All right, let me ask one final question, if I could, to wrap things up. As much as I'd like to stay here until we get several feet of snow on the ground, we probably shouldn't do that. It actually doesn't look like it's too serious out there. Because that's Washington. We always say it's going to snow 1 million feet, and then it snows like a little bit. But anyway, but I wanted to just a couple things that are happening right now. And the U.S. has since 2022 imposed some significant restrictions on semiconductors exports and equipment exports and sharing, and it has developed a relatively complex regime now, most recently suggesting with this AI diffusion rule that if you want to acquire graphical processors like that NVIDIA makes, for example, the U.S. is going to divide the world into 3 parts. Some places can buy these with no problem. Some places will need a license, and some places won't be able to get these. In addition, this week appears to be tariff week with regard to economic security, and everywhere. Imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum for others because of the needs to have reliable resources domestically for these, because aluminum and steel don't just work in your kitchen, they work in your military as well. So those are a couple things that the U.S. has been working on lately. But I also want to ask about what's the effect of those things, and I just want to bring up a trip. I was in Shanghai last month for another dialogue. And we went, and I'm not trying to offer Chinese propaganda or anything like that, but downtown Shanghai has a Huawei store. So I went into the Huawei store, and I encountered 2 things which were pretty impressive. One was Huawei's new cell phone, the Mate Pro 70S, which now operates with an operating system that is entirely local in China called Harmony OS. It used to be integrated with Android. It's now entirely separate. And that seems to be a product of the fact of trying to, of not being able to continue to do that and be pushed in a different way towards standards. The second thing you'll notice in that showroom is several cars that have IT systems that are have a heck of a lot of Huawei technology in them. And across the street was the Apple store. Apple stores are always cool, but there were no cars in the Apple store and stuff. And so the Huawei store was impressive. So this gets to the question of what is are the restrictions achieving their desired results? And I think that goes to the question about DeepSeek too, is people's impression, at least in the first day of media coverage, was that DeepSeek proves all of this was for naught. So I'm just curious about speaking to the intentions of these rules and why they're needed, because I think that there's a really important justification that Joe Q public doesn't necessarily understand. And then how should we evaluate the effectiveness of this? Is it every time we see a DeepSeek 2, we should go, oh, this doesn't work? Or what's a good yardstick to measure? And then from China's perspective, Zhao Jiong, how do you just say this is all unfair, all illegitimate, or we're in a world of strategic competition and countries are just going to protect their economic security as China would, and just let's all be adults about that. So maybe Matt will give you the first.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen a series of actions on semiconductors. You named sort of October 2022 as the start of it. Obviously, it goes back quite a bit further. I mean, semiconductors has always been, since the 1960s, since the creation of the industry, has been an area that the United States has placed dual-use export controls on. This was a point of serious technological competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. So it had all, the industry sort of grew up underneath these sort of dual-use export controls. And now what we've seen is a reapplication of those on chips in ways that they had been reduced sort of in the first kind of 15 years of the 21st century, where there have been assumptions of building a commercial electronics manufacturing bases in the PRC, and that's where you then would need to ship all of these chips in. They're primarily for consumer products, but obviously they still remain integral into national security products as well. And so that's where that sort of come from. I think our evidence around whether it's the sort of revelations of DeepSeek over the last 2 weeks, which certainly within the industry was known as late as early as sort of November of last year, certainly bubbling up within the community about what High Flyer, this quant hedge fund, was doing with its firm DeepSeek. I think whether or not those represent failures to export controls, I mean, it certainly would suggest that the ambitions that the Biden administration announced in October of 2022 were not achieved. I think as we go back and look at sort of the record on this, that what was announced was not necessarily what was enforced. And we see a series of tightenings of loopholes that happen over essentially a 2-year period to sort of tighten those things down. I think in many ways those loopholes were apparent within the first 4 to 6 weeks, yet it would take 11 to 12 months to close them. And it would suggest that really what needs to be done is better defense, not no defense, right? So conduct better defense on this than instead of lifting them. And I think fundamentally, I think that's where we've kind of arrived at the initial sort of read that DeepSeek, was built off a CapEx of like $5.5 million, and they had like 1,000 advanced chips, I think is now seen as kind of incorrect. That DeepSeek likely was relying upon something in the 50,000 advanced chip range of 100 and 800 and H20 chips from NVIDIA. And we're talking billions of dollars that have been set aside for this firm to be able to do this over a series of years, starting well before even those October 7th, 2022 export controls went into place. And so it suggests that there is a trailing aspect to sort of what we see. So there's actions that happen a while ago and you don't actually see them take place. They don't develop for months, if not years.
What year did Chinese companies were they able to make their own semiconductors? 1964. If you look at our first man-made satellite that was able to beam back the music, the East is red, 天方东方红, that was based on semiconductors made in China by the Chinese scientists. We have had a long debate on these matters. This also goes back to the Made in China 2025. You know, do you buy the latest, you know, or do you just procure, I mean, you buy or you make the lower end of it because you want to save on investment? This is the, or you start to create an ecosystem of your own. This sort of self-debates about domestic policy, if not, well, including elements of industrial policy in English. It goes on not just with semiconductors, this certainly arrives before the 2022. It's not related to limited to semiconductors. When you look at automobiles, you look at even the large civilian aircrafts. So what I'm really I'm not trying to sound defiant or jingoistic or accusatory or overly celebratory. What I'm really saying is that I understand these matters, especially in the US-China context, by constantly thinking each government or each society, at the end of the day, has to question itself and find that ecosystem that's fitting for purpose at different stages of time. So in other words, I'm not saying the US did this or China did that. Now, on the issue of IT connected cars, I do own a 100% battery car. I've been driving that for a year and a half. It's a German model made in Beijing. And why do it's IT connected? The car has 280 different chips, including, you know, they got 3 chips on each of the tires. So the message you get, the beep on your screen would tell you, okay, pressure on left tire is low. And, you know, these batteries, they have different components. The chips can be so precise, they can tell you this part of your battery is overheating and the next stage of repair is, you know, give you a warning. Now, where does all that data end up? The data ends up in the dealership. And when I take my car back to the dealer, what does he do? What the guy does is simply, you know, have one of those what's called dumb drives, right? He simply updates the system, and then I drive away. So normally it takes about an hour, and that's it. That's it. So I'm not trying to dramatize that. I am not a car geek person. So what I'm really trying to say is a choice. Let's be frank and honest. Battery technologies, you know, EVs, including hybrids, these are new. To me, as a consumer of an electric vehicle, I think it's a source of assurance in terms of safety, including, you know, of course, here in China, they commercialize everything. they always tell you where the next charging station is, right? And where you have to pay higher fees. There's a commercial element to it. So it's a choice. But I do understand there are foreign concerns. But then the technical question here, the question here is, do you have a technical solution to it? In other words, how true is that assumption that data collected on each individual car can go to a foreign center, and there's no way whatsoever to block that or to keep it local? That's a question that needs to be technically answered. To the extent I know, Chinese cars, EVs, that are exported normally turn that option off. Otherwise, it doesn't fit into the regulatory requirements of other countries. You have a separate gadget. I can turn it off. There is one of those chips. I can just unplug it, and then my car goes dark in the system as well. Now, the last question, to be a little more serious, is about Scott's question about sanctions, restrictions. If one wants to be frank and honest, China and the United States, in terms of the policy framework, including many of the legislations, down to the specific vocabularies, there is a good deal of mutual emulation. We emulate American approaches, philosophies, including specific measures on restrictions, whether it's raw material or technology or anything else. They just including, both are speaking on the same language. It's not also, it goes back to the earlier question about economic security, what we mean by security. I'm going to say something probably does not put me in a good light among Chinese audience here or others. There is some justification in American complaints about that China took the step first in placing these restrictions. And one of the most frequently mentioned examples took place in 2006, when the Chinese Minister of Commerce overruled a proposition for Caterpillar to acquire a company called Xuzhou Gongye that's based in Jiangsu. Now, what was the product in question? There was earth excavators, Caterpillar, right? Of course, the Chinese justification for that was that one of the investors of Caterpillar company was Carlyle. Carlyle, of course, in the United States has military connections as well. Now, that led to some good discussions. What I'm really trying to, including between Chinese and Americans, and both governments actually tried to work this out by encouraging the WTO to negotiate towards a government procurement agreement. And for various reasons, unfortunately, by 2012, that negotiation is going nowhere, multilateral negotiation. What I'm really trying to say is that rather than finger pointing who did what to whom first, let's try to figure out a way of talking to each other, including finding out some basic parameters under multilateral frameworks. Truly is telling me I really abused the time. I'm sorry about it.
That's okay. That's okay. Well, you abused it for good purposes, with good value. This has been a fascinating discussion about economic security, and we've tried to set the parameters of what we were talking about, why it is important, the trade-offs that one has to make, the justifications for what we've done and what China has done, and what we're going to continue. I think what people have concluded or said, interdependence is with us. It's a fact. But the boundaries of the interdependence are actually evolvable. It's not just a permanent thing. It's not less like the air. Exactly. It's different than that. And so, you know, we don't want to overstate economic security concerns, but you certainly don't want to understate them either. And I think that shift has been important in the United States, and it's also in China. So trying to figure out how to balance. I think the question that got to economic data points to the need that, you know, if there's not transparency then and good information, then national security officials are going to naturally lean toward assuming the worst. And they're going to impose tougher economic security restraints as a result of that. So there's things that we do to increase our security, or China does, which may end up not actually helping. This has been a fantastic conversation. If you all please join me in thanking Matt and Zhao. You all have sat through this for a very long day, and I think learned a lot. I want to bring this series of debates to a conclusion. You know, the China Power debates consistently each year ask us to focus on and evaluate the relative power of China and the United States and their relative influence. Influence is one component of power. And secondly, they've asked us every year the speakers to discuss what should be done. How can you increase or manage your security in an appropriate and effective way? And this year's conference carries on that tradition, but we've modified things in one way by having PRC participants here, and I want to thank all the Chinese participants, including Zhao and the others who've traveled from China to be here in Washington for this conversation. And hopefully what you all have seen is that Washington is a place where we, and CSIS in particular, where we encourage constructive debates about some of the most important issues the United States and the world are facing. It's the kind of conversations that we need to have everywhere with our Chinese counterparts and others around the world. So I think we all should celebrate what China Power has done over the years in building this foundation for critical conversations. And so to Bonnie Lin and her team, please join me in thanking. And to all of you here in the audience and watching online, these debates will continue. Thank you.